Anin Bojo. My name's Sherry Lawson. I'm host of Indigenous Voices. We're still here. My special guest today is Ben, and I'm going to have him introduce himself. He's a member of my community of Chippewas of Rama. Welcome, Ben. I'm so glad you're here. Please tell us a little bit about yourself. Introduce yourself however you think is proper.
Okay. Anin Bojo. Ben Cousineau and Disnikaz, Rama and Donjiba, Obashaji Dorum. My name's Ben Cousineau. I'm from Rama. I live in Gravenhurst, Ontario, and my clan is Martin. I live in Gravenhurst. I work here in Rama. I'm very happy and honored to be here, Sherry, and much for the invite. I'm a amateur historian. My full-time job is as archivist and researcher for Rama First Nation, and that's my passion. It's my real, become my life mission. Trying to undo some of the stereotypes that we know about our people. And it's an honor to be here and talk about those things. So thank you much for having me.
You didn't always figure this was going to be your job, did you, Ben?
No. So as background, Sherry hired me 7 years ago. And at that time, I grew up off the reserve. I've only lived here for a few years in my life. And I grew up not knowing about my Anishinaabe First Nation side. So when Sherry hired me, it was a chance to begin learning about that. So if you told me 8 years ago I was doing this kind of work, talking to you guys about what we're talking about today, I would have probably not believed you at all. So very different life than I imagined, but it's turned out pretty good so far.
Can you tell us about your education?
Sure. So initially I started going to college when I was a bit younger, when I was in my 20s, and it wasn't for me. I didn't like it too much. When I started working, and then wound up working for Sherry a few years later. Sherry more or less motivated and inspired me to go back to university. I finished a 3-year degree at Lakehead University, and then I've since re-enrolled to finish a 4-year degree. Besides that, I've also been doing museums training through the Ontario Museums Association, through their online professional development. So I've got a bit of formal education from Lakehead, and then continuous education from the Ontario Museums Association. So a bit of both, a wide mix of everything.
Okay, thank you. So what is basically your job working for the Chippewas of Rama?
Well, it changes every day. I mean, yesterday we were at the sugar bush here in Rama, tapping trees and teaching kids about what it is what it takes to make maple syrup, something our ancestors invented. And generally, I mean, my job title is archivist and researcher. So that's mostly sitting behind a computer, researching our history, looking into treaties, looking into the history of Rama and First Nations people in general. But my day job generally, it's archiving our history. It's making sure that it's available for the next generations. So I live in the past generally, and, I'm looking at things that most people haven't thought about for a long time, but it's really important because here in Rama, at least, we have we're pretty fortunate to have what we have, but our history and our early beginnings are the same as most First Nations across Canada. So remembering where we came from is important, because now we're at a really fortunate stage.
So how do you make that information that you gather available?
Well, we've collected thousands and thousands of photographs and documents and all kinds of stuff from the past. And it's for a long time just sat in boxes or, been in people's basements or in cupboards or whatever. And it wasn't very good for accessibility. So now, especially with COVID and the virtual things such as this, we're able to take things online and really try to facilitate people's access to culture and archives. So one way is through our online community archives, which I started up a couple of years ago. We recently started a Zoom virtual series featuring yourself, Sherry, last week. So a little bit of everything, but more and more it's becoming connecting people to everything via the internet. And it's just because it's easier. No one wants to go through boxes for hours and hours looking at photographs. So connecting it virtually makes it much easier to do so.
You must have people who call you cold and ask you questions about who knows what. Would that be so?
Oh, yeah, that's a daily thing. Rama, we're a small community, but our membership is far and wide. We have people from New Mexico, people living in England. So in many cases, these people they've never been to the reserve, never been to Rama. So they have a lot of questions, and they're probably my favorite person to call because they're from here, but they don't know anything about Rama and they just want to learn. So that's one of the main groups of people who calls. But a lot of the time too, especially since the Truth and Reconciliation report, we've had a lot of people just interested and wanting to know the real history about the relationship between Canada and Indigenous peoples. So when those people call in, it's a really great chance for me to just completely blow their mind with the real history and the real things that happened right here in Canada. And, that's enjoyable because you're very, very slowly chipping away at all these things that we've seen happen to our people for a long time. And, that one person can tell someone else and so on. And all of a sudden you have a chain of people who have learned something that they didn't know before. And it's a really rewarding part of the job.
Tell us about your what you know about other First Nations communities, both on and off reserve, and how successful have they been with archives and museums?
Yeah, it differs from community to community. Many communities don't have staff or resources like Rama does, or like a lot of other bigger First Nations do. So, the role of a cultural department or a museum just hasn't been considered because there isn't the resources or the finances to take that on. So a lot of First Nations just don't have the ability. And those who do, they're just putting together community museums or partnering with local universities or smaller community museums in their area. Archives-wise, I think across Canada, First Nations are really struggling because archives require a lot of technical ability, materials and resources. Not every First Nation has high-speed internet. Not every First Nation has computer access. So we're fortunate here that we have those things, but generally, I think most First Nations would say they're struggling. And especially when you consider that, the records that we generally rely on are government records. We're not really getting the full story of our community's history. We're relying on the government, which looked after us, right, for so long to tell us our own stories. So slowly we're starting to take those stories back and do it our own way.
Do you have any kind of a relationship with mainstream museums and archives, and how did that come about?
Yeah, it comes up from time to time. Generally what happens is a museum is working on an exhibit about First Nations people or Rama specifically. And sometimes it's just they want to know if they're going in the right way. They want to consult and make sure they're not being disrespectful. And then sometimes when it's more specific about Rama, they want us to be involved completely. They want us to tell our own story, which is really great because, I've heard of cases where museums are writing exhibits on people without checking with the people they're writing exhibits on, which is crazy, but it happens. So when we're being consulted with from the beginning about a museum exhibit, about, telling our history and who we are, when we can say it in our own words and put it through our own perspective, that's ideal. And it happens locally. We have a bit of a relationship with OMA, the museum in Aurelia. There's a museum in Gravenhurst called the Muskoka Discovery Center. We have a small relationship with them too. So gradually we're building these things up. And again, that's really started since the Truth and Reconciliation report, when these museums were very strongly encouraged to do that kind of work.
Okay. I want to tell you a story, and I don't think I ever told you this story, Ben, about a museum in Simcoe County that pretty much every kid in public school in Simcoe County used to go and visit, about grade 5 or 6. Now, I remember getting on the bus from town when I was sent to school for town, and we rode to the museum, and we had a little assignment to do, and we walked around, looked at everything, but they particularly wanted us to look at the Indian display, of course. And I remember going in there as that little kid, and there was a bunch of pots and some weaving, and then it was sitting kind of on gravel off the floor, and then behind it there was a bunch of baskets stuck on the wall, and there was a skeleton hanging on the wall, and there was a big sign that says Indian woman, year unknown. And I remember going in there and thinking, wait a minute, that might be one of my ancestors there. I don't think we should be doing this. Well, needless to say, after I brought that up with the person who was doing the tour, I was never invited back there. But tell us, what are some of the challenges facing you in the work that you're trying to do?
The biggest challenge I would say is time, because we're fighting a battle where, our culture and our history and our languages were illegal, literally illegal for a long time. So all that work that the government put into oppressing our people, to keeping our language restricted, to keeping our culture banned, it's had an effect where we've forgotten who we are in a lot of ways. And I'm an example of that, right? I grew up not knowing about my First Nation side. So undoing all of that time, all of that damage that was inflicted upon our people is difficult. So when I say the biggest challenge is time, I mean, we have elders in our community who are, 60, 70, 80, and so on. And they have so much knowledge and language and experience that we want to hold on to it and just keep it forever, but we can't. So we're trying to somehow capture that and somehow keep everything from dying off while still preserving enough to pass on to our kids and their kids and so on. So the biggest challenge, in my opinion, is time. And I don't know how we stop it. We can't stop it, but we just need to try to preserve what we have through archiving, through videos, through all these amazing virtual means that we now have, and hope that we can access it for the next, 7 generations, as we say.
So do you have, what are some of the programs and services that you create to make sure you hold on to those things? Besides you being in the office and taking the calls, what other kinds of things are going on?
Well, it's difficult because, COVID has really affected the work that we do, and we've had to kind of pivot and look at how we do things. So I mentioned doing Zoom talks instead of in-person, speakers, and it's just the way of the world right now. So we've launched a Zoom series where we welcome people to come and listen to elders and storytellers like yourself, Sherry, and we hope that we can pass on some of that knowledge that way. Otherwise, it's a matter of just archiving everything we can, recording our language as much as we can, recording our elders and our seniors. And again, it's difficult because of COVID, but I hope whenever this passes, we're able to interview our elders and document and preserve their history and their language and their knowledge, because once it's gone, it's gone. So everything's, being considered that way. We just have to preserve everything as long as we can and go from there.
Do you have any kind of a relationship with the children in our community?
Yeah, so our department, it's located centrally. We're right in front of the arena. And as a result, our school is next door to the arena. So our kids are nearby. And COVID, again, has affected that. But just last week, or in this week, rather, they were at the sugar bush with us. So they're in the sugar bush up here in Rama, and they're learning about tapping trees and making maple syrup. And it's those kind of things that we're trying to pass on to them, because, you can look it up on Google, but there's nothing like going in a bush and watching someone tap a tree, and then they'll come out and watch us boiling that sap down, and they'll eventually taste that maple syrup too. So all of those things, just giving them hands-on land-based learning is what we're trying to do. And of course, incorporating language into the community and the schools and so on as much as we can is important too.
So do you have any connection to any of the younger children, the ones who aren't in school yet?
Yeah, at the daycare. We have a daycare here in Rama, and it's before my colleague was heading in there and doing drumming and singing and teaching them some cultural things. And now with COVID, it's not been able to happen, but our department historically has always gone in there and tried to enjoy a bit of time with the youngest ones in the community.
Okay. You mentioned how there were so many things that were government imposed that made us lose a lot of our culture, language, ceremonies. And with Truth and Reconciliation, people are starting to talk about those things. Can you give our viewers a specific example of something that we're really trying to hold on to now?
I think the best example, I get going back to it, is language, because, our cultural people and our elders here, they say that everything is in the language. And unfortunately, I don't speak it. I know a tiny bit, but not as much as I'd like to. And what we're trying to hold on to more than anything is our language. Our ceremonies and our culture, of course, are important too, but the language is at the heart of all of it. So trying to hold on to that language, which was forbidden to be spoken by our people for a long time, which the government outlawed across the country. which our kids were beaten for speaking in residential schools. Holding on to that language is the most important part of our work. And I can't stress it enough. It's endangered. We know all these facts about it, that we only have 9 or 10 fluent speakers in the community, if that. And it's something that First Nations across Canada are struggling with, and many have already lost their languages. So we're just trying to stop it as much as we can and learn as much as we can in the meantime.
Okay, thank you. I want to take you back to the mainstream museums, and there's still many of them throughout this country, and probably even in this county, that would have a glass case with a very long-handled pipe in it. So there you are, Ben, as the guy who helps look after culture in our community. You walk into that museum. Tell us what's going through your head and what's going to happen.
Yeah, well, it's something that I've changed my opinion on more recently too. I grew up going to museums and thinking it was cool to see these old things and cases, and that they were antiques and relics of a culture that had died off 1,000 years ago, right? But when you see our pipes and our items and glass cases, that's not how it's meant to be, because all of those things have a spirit, and they're all meant to be used and honored and cherished. And when they're put in a case after they've been taken from the community, they're put in a case and we're told, you can't have these, you can't touch these things anymore, they're ours. And if we say we want them back, a lot of the time they say, no, they're ours. And then if we say, well, please, then they say, okay, well, do you have a humidity controlled room? Do you have the proper case? Do you have the proper storage? And we say, no, we just want to use it. And they say, too bad, it's ours now. And that's the way museum practice has generally gone in Canada for a long time. Now museums are starting to change, again, because of Truth and Reconciliation, and they're more open to repatriating all kinds of artifacts. But it's difficult. It's difficult seeing those things in cases when we know that that's not how they're meant to be, that our ancestors who built them and who used them and who smoked them and so on, they didn't want those things to be in cases for generations, or worse, in the basement storage of museums. At least in cases they're being seen, but generally these things are kept away, locked away from everybody for a long time. So it's difficult to see that, and more and more things are being repatriated, but there's still a lot of work to be done on that front.
So when you find these things in one of these mainstream places and somebody else owns it, sounds to me like what you're saying, is there anything actually socially or legally you can do to get those things back?
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult because the museum wants to know that your community or whoever you're speaking on behalf of has the legal right to that item or artifact. So although I can see a pipe in a museum somewhere in the ROM, if I say that's ours, they might say, well, actually, our records say that it belongs to Rainy River First Nation or somewhere like that way up north. But then if I say we traveled and that might have been used by an ancestor up there, they might say, well, that's difficult because we can't prove that. So it's two very, very different worldviews clashing with one another. And like I said, now more and more museums are getting better at accepting that the things need to be back with the community that they came from, or that says that it's theirs. But it's really tough. And the way to go about it now is, we formally request the repatriated item. We have to have, all the proper certifications and papers from our leaders or whoever is running the show. And it's a long process, but it is a very formal one too. And most museums have a repatriation policy. And I don't know about OMA, but I know the ROM certainly has one. And it's a lengthy document. It's something that they've obviously worked on quite a bit, but it's still intimidating for anybody to face it up. And I think most First Nations don't have that, A, knowledge that it exists, but B, the people and the desire to go ahead and proceed with repatriating items, because it's difficult and it's not costly, but it's very time consuming.
Ben, you've mentioned relationship or perhaps non-relationship with some of the museums. So tell us what would happen if you go through the entire process. You've seen that pipe in a glass case and you did all the paperwork you had to do. You gave the proof that it belongs to our community, and then you go pick it up and bring it back to Rama. What's the process now? In terms of bringing it back to Rama, well, it would be a big deal. We'd be bringing a pipe home to its community. So I don't want to speak to what kind of ceremony would be involved, but it would definitely be a really happy one. It'd be a celebratory one. We'd be bringing that pipe back to its community. So
people would be really happy, and there'd be a lot of ceremony and honor in that pipe too.
Ben, so you said that it would be a big deal if that pipe came back to the community. And that's because you mentioned before how everything has a spirit, a life in it. Am I correct?
Yeah, of course. We'd want to honor that pipe for coming back home to its community, and there'd be a lot of cultural protocols and things that would happen for it. And, you know, it'd be like we're receiving a family member, you know, coming back home. You'd be really happy and honored to see it, and we'd treat it with a lot of respect and just be really appreciative to see it again. Remember, these things might have been away from the community for a long time. They might have been taken by somebody at some point in history, and to finally have those things returned, it would be a big celebration, I think.
Okay, thank you. Can you tell us a little bit about archaeological work? There's people who say, well, if you're building a new arena and you dig up something there that might be possibly Aboriginal, there's something that needs to happen, or just move it over there and keep on digging. What can you tell us about that type of thing?
Yeah, that's difficult because we know both things happen all the time. We know that remains and artifacts are uncovered, and developers want to just keep moving on. And you know, there's a process that needs to be followed, because when things are uncovered, those are, if not our ancestors, then another First Nations ancestors, and those are their things that they had with them throughout their life. So, you know, there has to be a lot of respect involved, and generally that's the case. When things are uncovered or when remains are accidentally uncovered, usually, you know, the process is that police are notified, and then the police contact archaeologists, and archaeologists usually contact the local First Nation or the First Nation that has an affiliation with the area. So, you know, there's a lot to really go over with that, but generally, whenever our remains or our ancestors' remains are uncovered, we want to be there to make sure that things are being handled in a good way. And ideally, they're left in the ground and they're not moved or touched any further. But worst case, if they have to be excavated, then it's vital that the First Nation, you know, connected to the area is involved from start to finish, because we're talking about what could be our great-grandparents' remains, our great-great-grandparents, or any ancestors' remains. And similar to any non-Indigenous person, you know, if you have something or somebody desecrating your ancestors' graves, you're going to be upset and it's going to hurt. So from that point, it's just about mitigating that emotional damage and all that trauma that could, you know, arise from that. So it's really about respect and just trying to have a bit of sympathy and understanding that those are our ancestors in the ground.
So is there any rule or any law or any bylaw that says that has to happen? If the person is driving the vehicle with the scoop on the front, who's involved with this? Who's going to stop things?
Yeah, they're governed by the province, and there's federal legislation as well. So it isn't just a wild, wild west. They do have to follow a lot of guidelines and laws, and I mean, that's good. We just want to make sure that everything's being done in a good way. So there certainly are laws, and people always assume to comply with them. And fortunately, we're contacted not too often about, you know, remains being uncovered. There have been a few higher profile instances, but generally it doesn't happen that often. And that's a result of us advocating for ourselves and speaking to our knowledge about certain areas. You know, if we get a request for consultancy or information about a certain site that may be developed, if we have knowledge about that site, we pass it on. It could potentially stop, you know, any kind of damage being done to an archaeological site. But it's really, like I said, it goes back to respect. It's just respecting the history of the land and the history of the people who once lived there or currently do live there too.
I would expect that the developers or other people involved with this might not be too happy that everything stopped. Would I be right?
Yeah, I mean, developers are trying to build as quickly as they can and make money, and that's understandable. So any kind of stop work order is costly. It's literally costing them who knows how much money every single hour and day they stop working. So obviously they wouldn't be happy. I would hope that most would be respectful and appreciate what they're doing, and appreciate that, you know, they're literally digging up people's remains or digging up people's things from who knows how long ago. So obviously they're not going to be happy, but at the same time, I would hope it goes back to that same thing I keep saying, right? Where they're respectful of the work that they're doing and they act accordingly.
Okay. I want you to think about the future, Ben. You're way younger than me, but in your job, in your position, I want you to look ahead and tell me what you see in the future.
Well, it's hard because, it's like I said, it's a race against time. And fortunately, our culture is being revitalized. Our people aren't really, there's all that shame that had inflicted our parents and our grandparents about being Anishinaabe, being First Nations. That seems to be going away now. Now our people are more proud of who they are. They're proud to be Anishinaabe. They're proud to be First Nations. So with pride comes a bit of confidence, and with confidence comes, the courage to put yourself out there and say, this is who I am. And now, for example, our powwow has 300 dancers from all across Turtle Island. So that's the strongest example of that. As we get more and more confident and that shame that was instilled upon us goes away a little bit, then gradually we're going to start picking things up again. We're going to lose that fear about learning our culture and language. We're going to want to take these things up, and perhaps, most importantly, we want to pass it on to our kids, because we recognize that our parents, for whatever reason, didn't pass it on to us. They were told that being this way was wrong, so they don't want their kids to be that way, naturally. You want the best for your children, right? So now, as we're learning that being Anishinaabe is good, it's an amazing, beautiful thing, we're wanting to pass it on to our kids so they can pass it on to their kids. And slowly, all this work that was, pushed upon First Nations people across Canada by the government is starting to be undone. With all that pride, with all that confidence, things are changing. And it's slow, and every day seems slower. But at the same time, history tends to move slow. If we look back in 20 years, who knows where we're going to be? I hope that our community here is fluent in the Anishinaabe moment. I hope that our ceremonies are vibrant. I hope that all of these things are happening, and the race against time, the need for people like myself, the cultural staff, isn't there anymore because the community is just functioning that way naturally, right? It's fallen to handfuls of people in every community across Canada because for whatever reason, they've been able to preserve a little bit of it. And, best case scenario, those people aren't needed because the entire community is that way, and the entire community is chipping in and teaching one another about the culture and language.
Ben Cousineau, thank you so much for joining us today on Indigenous Voices. We're Still Here. When we came up with the title for that, I thought we better put in We're Still Here, because I think before the half hour we just spent together, some people might say, are Aboriginal people still here? We're not just in dusty museum cases. We're still here and we're going strong. Thank you so much for visiting today.
Thanks for having me.